It's tempting to anticipate finding definitive evidence of Joseph and the early Israelites in the archaeological finds at Avaris. However, as I talked to many experts about this enterprise, I learned not to expect evidence of a specific person if you go looking for them. As you look at Joseph in archaeology, it's very rare. People say you don't look for people in archaeology. That's impossible.
Yes, you might come across somebody in archaeology, but don't expect to find them if you go looking.
Yeah, but some people are looking for Ramesses. They're looking for great leaders in archaeology, right?
Yeah, well, when you've got a king like Ramesses II, of course, you've got inscriptions adorning all the walls of the temples, so you're going to have lots of information about him. But if you're talking about a Semite, a Semitic-speaking person who comes in from abroad into Egypt, why would you expect to find monuments of him?
Mm-hmm. So that would be very unusual if you did find a monument of someone like Joseph.
Absolutely. The high officials of state, you might find the odd inscription, you might find the odd small statue of them, but when it comes to the big monuments, the pyramids, the colossal statues, those are for kings and for queens.
Tell me about BTEC's archaeology. What is it that fascinated you? What caught your attention the first time?
Well, it's a very long period site, this Avaris, but it begins in the 12th dynasty, at the end of the 12th dynasty, with a small little settlement, a village of maybe 12 or 15 houses. And these houses are occupied by Semitic-speaking peoples, people from the north. They're not Egyptian. And one of the houses in particular is a Syrian-style house. The Germans call it a Mittelsaal house. It's typical of the area of Haran in North Syria, and Haran is where Abraham and his descendants came from.
So in other words, you're saying that that house would be similar because they would have built the style house that they were accustomed to.
What's happening here is you've got people coming from North Syria.
How many?
Who knows? A tribe, 70 people maybe, something like that. A large tribe coming down from the north. They bring their architectural styles with them, and they build a house for their leader at Avaris, in this city in the land of Goshen. And that leader is Jacob.
What would you find at this house that would correspond in the pattern of the Bible story of Joseph and his father Jacob coming?
Well, after this house of Jacob, if we can call it that, this Syrian Mittelsaal house is built, eventually it's flattened, and on top of it, an Egyptian palace is constructed, Egyptian architecture this time. However, the occupant was not Egyptian, because we have his tomb in the garden of this palace, and it's a pyramid tomb. But the difference is, the guy that was buried in the tomb was in fact a Semite, a Semitic-speaking person. We can tell by the statue, the cult statue that was placed in the chapel in front of it. And all the other people who were buried in that garden are also Semites as well. And what we see is an audience chamber with 4 columns where he would have greeted visitors. There is a robing room, strangely enough, and there is a bedroom with the largest bed in the ancient world, which is quite extraordinary. Nobody's found a bed this size ever before. And of course, Joseph was the interpreter of dreams, so it's very, very appropriate. Okay, and we have these 12 columns, these 12 pillars on the facade of the building. And of course, I looked at this, I was looking at the plans of this palace, and I thought, hang on a minute, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 pillars on the facade. And then I turned to the garden, and there were 12 tombs as well.
That sounds very, very significant.
It's spooky.
Some have pointed out that there were other tombs in the area, so that it is not appropriate to single out these 12 as being connected to Joseph and the patriarchs. However, Professor Bitek, in his own model of the site, highlighted the principal nature of these 11 vaulted tombs, along with the pyramid tomb. A similar issue is at play with the columns, where the original palace building had 12 columns across the front, but the structure was later expanded, adding 2 identical suites for living quarters. These resulted in the original 12 columns being enclosed in the courtyard, and the Bible does record that Joseph had 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. David Rowe speculates that these additions could have been the living quarters for Joseph's sons and their families. So what you have is you have the region, actually the city, where the Bible states that
Jacob and Joseph and his family settled.
Yeah. You have the evidence of a small group coming in.
And building into a huge city over a space of 4 generations. That matches the biblical story.
Okay, and then you have a home that would be a palace that would be associated with this type of ruler.
Yeah.
And then the association with the 12 pillars.
Yeah.
The 12 tombs.
All that's there.
Okay, and it all matches the story. Then you have a statue then, don't you, of Joseph that we could see?
I think we do have. It's not complete. It's smashed to pieces. The bottom half is missing.
Why is that?
Probably because it was the shape of a block and it was reused somewhere else at a later date. But the thing is, that would have been where the name would have been carved. So the very part that we need to prove it's Joseph is missing. What we have is the shoulders and the head. But even the face is smashed up. So we only have little clues.
Is this custom to do this type of thing?
No, this is revenge.
Really?
Somebody's taken revenge out on that statue. Remember who this Joseph character is. If this is Joseph, he's the guy that brought the Israelites into Egypt. Okay, he's the guy that brought these people, of course, Egyptians, all this terrible pain and anguish over the 10 plagues. So he's the guy they're going to take it out on. But his body's not there to do that anymore. That's gone. Mm-hmm. So they take their anger out on the statue. Interesting.
Is it customary for statues in Egypt to be defaced?
It's not the custom normally. Normally statues are royal. So if they're going to be broken, it's because they've fallen over and the nose is broken off or something. It's very rare that you get something like this where the eyes have been gouged out and somebody's tried to attack it with an axe, which is what's happened in this case.
Really? So what do you think this Avaris means to the story of the Bible?
I think it's probably the first tangible evidence we've got to prove the early stories of the Bible are true.
Now, David Rolls is suggesting that BTEC has a palace there that is a palace of a Semitic ruler. What are your thoughts on that palace and the idea that Joseph came from that period, his family came into that earlier group?
Mm-hmm. There has been important discoveries made at Tel Adaba, and we know that there was this foreign population. We have a tomb of a high-ranking Hyksos period official that some have suggested could be Joseph. Well, it would be wonderful if there was some evidence that we could tie to Joseph, such as an inscription with a name. So in the absence of that kind of direct correlation, it's best to leave such theorizing aside, because if future excavations reveal the name of this person and it turns out not to be Joseph, then the speculation was not very helpful. It certainly is an intriguing thing to think about, and who knows? That's a wonderful thing about archaeology. New evidence is always just around the corner. So I prefer to be cautious, not to jump to conclusions until we have firm archaeological data.
This settlement dates to, again, the time of Joseph and the time that Jacob and his family came into Egypt and settled down. And so these are folks that were using Asiatic-type pottery. It wasn't Egyptian pottery, pottery that they had brought with them. It comes from southern Canaan. It's been tested by neutron activation analysis. And so these folks came from southern Canaan. They were pastoralists. They established a small village, small little houses. South of the little village was a cemetery where they buried their dead. The interesting thing about the village is that there was one major structure, large structure, sort of located in the center with a compound around it, and then these smaller little houses all around that central structure. That central structure has a very interesting layout. It's laid out like what we call the four-room house, which has been found in Israel in the Iron Age I period, the time of the judges, the time when the Israelites were settling down. And the layout is exactly the same, which is very interesting. So this suggests the connection between this later Israelite house and this structure that has been found there in this village.
Do you think that this house, this four-room house, was this something that Manfred Bittek had found?
Yes, Manfred Bittek excavated this little Asiatic village.
Is this called a Mittelsaal house?
Yes, it is. Mittelsaal house is what he called it. A house built around a courtyard. It's not strictly speaking, a courtyard. It's a rather narrow space, but in the middle of the house, probably left open, probably where they had their fire pits and baking ovens and so on. And then there was other rooms around that central room. And this is the way the Israelite four-room house is constructed as well. In Israel, we know it's related to agriculture and farming and so on. Some of those rooms were used for animals, others for storing their grain after the harvest, for storing tools and so on. And so it seems that that design began in Egypt way back in the days of Joseph. In fact, perhaps that was Joseph's house. We don't know, but it was some home of an important person, a leader. It was centrally located, larger than the others, with some, courtyard space and so on. But we can only speculate on where Joseph might have lived because we're not told specifically. But I would imagine after he finished his duties with Pharaoh and the years of famine were over with, he would have wanted to live with his family. I don't see why he wouldn't have moved to Ramses. But anyway, that's rather speculative. But I think there is this connection between the Israelite four-room house and this structure there at Tel el-Daba, ancient Ramses. Now, you might ask a question, well, that's a long time span between the time of Joseph, 1800 BC, all the way up to 1200, 1100 BC. How do you connect those two time-wise? And I think the answer lies in the tents that the Israelites used, believe it or not. And I'm not the first one to suggest this kind of a connection, but I think Israel Finkelstein was the first one that noticed that Bedouin tents have the same layout as an Israelite four-room house. So he was suggesting that whoever built the four-room house was previously a nomadic person living in a tent and had used that kind of a layout, and so they simply built it in stone when they settled down in a village. And so that would be the connection that I would make when the Israelites left Egypt and started living in tents. They made the tent according to this plan that they had back there in Egypt, and they continued it all the way down to 1200, 1100 BC till they began to build stone houses.
Let me ask you this. I've heard that the type of house was actually seen earlier in, let's say, Syria. In other words, was it familiar to Abraham, and that type of building was even from an earlier time where they would have come from, that they would have taken that notion with them?
That's possible, but the earlier plan, I think, was a bit different. This four-room house tends to have long, narrow rooms, 3 parallel rooms, and then a room across the back that made up the 4 rooms. Earlier on, you have these courtyard houses, which had kind of a square courtyard, large open space in the middle, and small little rooms all the way around the outside. So the concept is somewhat similar, but not identical.